Well, good evening to all of you. My name is Geneva Oberholzer, and I am the director of the journalism school here at Annenberg. And I want to welcome all of you to another in a series of lectures at Annenberg on the topic of entrepreneurship and the future of news. This series, as you know, is part of our dean's new focus on economic literacy and entrepreneurship at Annenberg. And it's aimed at stimulating our thinking, and we certainly need that, about how we breathe new life and new vitality into journalism as the digital revolution continues to unfold. Tonight I have a really very special privilege of introducing a longtime colleague and dear friend who is one of the real pioneers in encouraging innovation and creativity and entrepreneurial thinking in journalism. It's not just the business model that's broken, Jan often says, it's also the journalism that needs fixing. Jan Schaffer, who is former business editor and a Pulitzer Prize winner for the Philadelphia Inquirer, heads American University's J-Lab in Washington, D.C., where she tells me there's 4 feet of snow. In her leadership of J-Lab, Jan is one of the nation's most important catalysts for spurring new thinking, new voices, and creativity in journalism. Let me share just a few of the ways. It really is a remarkable set of innovations that Jan has been responsible for. The center rewards innovative practices through the Knight Batten Awards for innovations in journalism. It provides grants for citizen media startups through its New Voices projects. It built tutorials on how to launch and manage community news websites. It collects information on community, citizen, and original journalism projects with the Knight Citizen News Network. And it gives women in media new opportunities through the New Media Women Entrepreneurs Project, which McCormick Foundation supports. If all of that sounds like a lot, it only begins to capture Jan's contributions to the cause of journalism innovation. Previously, for example, she led the Pew Center for Civic Journalism, a $14 million project that helped fund more than 120 pilot projects aimed at more fully engaging people in public life. Jan really has been a pioneer in helping move journalism forward, and it is a great pleasure to have her here with us tonight. We're especially pleased that J-Lab has funded one of Annenberg's many new community ventures, the South Los Angeles Reporting Project, which you can learn more about tomorrow here in this room at noon. I take great personal pleasure in introducing you to Jan Schaffer.
Wow, well, thanks for a great introduction, and thanks for coming. I understand for many of you that it's midterms, so I'm surprised that you were able to come, but I appreciate it. I will apologize for a foghorn voice, and if I collapse in a paroxysm of coughing, don't panic, it'll end. But I want to, I'm happy to be here, and I want to tip my hat to USC. We're really pleased to fund efforts like the South LA Reporting Project, and I just got an earful a little earlier today of so many other things that you have going on here. It's very, very impressive, and I think the place is really cooking in terms of new ideas for journalism. I have a lot I want to share with you today, and I want to start with a little story. One that reflects, I think, how some citizen journalists are contributing to today's changing news landscape. And in 2005, we funded one of our first startup community news projects. It was in Deerfield, New Hampshire, a very rural community. It didn't get much coverage in many of the state's newspapers. And then we funded it 2 years later, in 2007, a very similar kind of community news project in Chappaqua, New York, in one of their little hamlets called Newcastle. And it's a very wealthy bedroom community right outside of New York City. Both of these places at best got episodic coverage. Journalists would parachute in, cover crime or something terrible, parachute out again. You never see them again for 2 years. Well, now, in both places, citizens regularly cover town hall meetings and school board meetings that never got consistent coverage. When people first began showing up, the town leaders didn't like it very much. They said, "What are you doing here?" They were very suspicious. The Deerfield Farm founders were mostly Democrats in a, frankly, Republican stronghold. Newcastle Now founders were former PTA presidents and activists, so surely these folks were up to no good, right? But the citizen journalists persisted. They kept writing stories about their meetings. The stories were accurate. They had impact. New faces were elected to the Chappaqua School Board. More voters turned out on Election Day in Deerfield. And people in town learned about some issues before they became done deals. And the town leaders started to relax a little bit. And they even began counting on the coverage. So that now, when a citizen journalist can't make it to a meeting, they get a little put out. Where are you? You know, why weren't you there? They want to know. How dare these citizen reporters take a vacation or have a conflict at home? So I think what we're seeing is that these sites and scores like them are developing a reputation for being not just good community news outlets, but also good community stewards. Quite frequently, they are started by people who have long been active in the community, people who carry a lot of community knowledge. In Deerfield, the founding editor, Maureen Mann, was so respected by the community that she was recently elected state representative. She stopped writing for the Deerfield Forum now as managing editor. She still writes, but she's not the managing editor anymore. But she does write about the legislature in a very explanatory way, kind of peeling back the layers of the onion. So, welcome to both the promises and perils of this new breed of citizen journalists. I would suggest to you they're not merely bloggers inveighing against something they don't like. They're more than photographers or videographers bearing witness to some catastrophe or breaking news event. They do more than post tweets shouting out some kind of coverage or news of the moment. They really have deputized themselves to systematically cover town news as best as they can. Some of the sites have actual beats. They have formulated rules of governance. They have guidelines for content. They have sought nonprofit status from the IRS. They edit content that comes from their contributors. They moderate comments. Some even buy libel insurance. And for the most part, they're doing this as a labor of love. They're lucky if they can raise enough money to get reimbursed to drive to a town meeting or to pay for a babysitter. You have to excuse me. They're looking to do more than just dispassionately cover their communities. They're seeking to connect and inform people in ways that might help their communities do well. Now, that's an aspiration that might be out of the comfort zone of a lot of traditional journalists. As important, these citizen journalists feel like they're really making a difference. I would suggest to you that their activities are really a form of citizen participation as much as citizen journalism. And that's one reason I prefer to call them citizen media makers. Sorry, guys. Besides, a lot of them don't like the term citizen journalist. Some are terrified of it, but others simply don't respect it. They don't really respect what journalists have done in their communities. It's also one reason why many of them are not as focused on making money as their professional counterparts, who expects to be paid for being a community volunteer. The good news is they're doing a pretty responsible job. The not so good news is that there's no backup when they're not around. As I look at how the media ecosystem is evolving in communities large and small across the United States, I am more optimistic than pessimistic that citizens will get their information needs met. I also think that traditional journalists will play a much smaller, albeit still important role as the gatherers and disseminators of news. Others, though, will have increasingly more important roles to play. These people include, yes, our citizen media makers, but also backed entrepreneurs, creative technologists, philanthropic foundations, universities, advocacy groups, and even governments. In this future, though, I think both professional and amateur journalists will need to engage in more than just journalism. They have to engage in new kinds of news work to serve their audience. News work, fact entrepreneurs. Credit for those terms goes to a Columbia University doctoral student, Chris Anderson. But I think these terms help us understand that journalism in the future has to involve more than just gathering and validating and writing news stories. News work also requires such things as sharing information, facilitating conversations, crowdsourcing, smart curation and aggregation, data mining and data visualizations, commissioning news games, gathering lists and resources, and shouting out and marketing your good work to others. It is in this era, the whole arena of news work, that I think there is much experimentation being done and a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities. So far, I think, we have the advantage of a lot of lessons learned, and we have some emerging clues to guide us if we pay attention to them. And I think particularly important are the clues about what kinds of news and information people want. Not only to be smarter about their communities, but also to empower them to be active citizens. And many of these clues suggest that while news consumers certainly need watchdogs, they also need guide dogs as well. While they certainly need news, sometimes all they need is good information. And while they want conversation and participation, they appreciate a level of connection that demonstrates sort of an attachment and a caring about their community, not just detached kind of clinical observations. They want to know about issues and choices and solutions, but they'd also like to know where people agree and not just where they're shouting and disagreeing. Some of these clues, I believe, will tell us that professional journalists need to re-examine some of their old habits, their journalistic conventions, if you will, to meet the information needs of their communities. And I'll talk about more on that in a second. For now, I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize. Is the prize just restoring commercial journalism outlets to profitability? Or is it serving the needs of citizens in ways that are valuable enough to engender their support and engaging enough to elicit their active participation? How you address that question, I believe, will chart your entrepreneurial course. So as we look at journalistic innovations to date, there are some common threads to many of the newest ideas. One is simply an element of filling a need. Many new ideas are simply identifying what's missing and trying to supply it. So consider some of these developments. Hundreds of hyperlocal sites have launched in communities that rarely saw a traditional journalist unless something terrible happened. Citizens just have decided to take matters into their own hands. So you get sites like Oakland Local, West Seattle Blog, Davidson News Net outside of Charlotte, Metropolis, which is a site that covers Center City, Philadelphia. We're starting to see new state-based investigative news projects beginning to supplement this diminishing watchdog journalism. Look at the rise in just the last hardly even 2 years of such things as California Watch, or Wisconsin Watch, or Investigate West. Last year even saw the creation of an organizing body for these initiatives called the Investigative News Network. We also now see niche publications addressing special interests with a very sharp clarity of focus. For example, Politico.com serves the political junkies in DC and elsewhere. Global Post offers international news and photos. Even Neiman Journalism Lab is giving Jim Romanesco's blog a run by doing original reporting, not just aggregating links to stories. Indeed, at J-Lab, we've funded a number of niche projects, including a site in Ohio about general aviation called Stories That Fly, and a soon-to-launch site called ChickRx. It's a healthcare site for young women that is a brainchild of a Harvard MBA student. And I think we see new fact entrepreneurs, be they Matt Drudge at the Drudge Report or Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo, who are unearthing information that keep professional journalists on their toes. Besides need, I think another characteristic shared by entrepreneurs is an element of liberation. Some of the best news entrepreneurs today have engaged in acts of liberation. Consider it. Citizen journalists have liberated themselves from journalistic conventions and traditional definitions of news, either because they didn't know any better or they didn't like what they saw traditional journalists doing. They're simply responding to different needs in their communities. Professional journalists who have left their old news organizations have been liberated to build new ones entirely from scratch. Look at the Chicago News Cooperative, founded by former Chicago Tribune and LA Times editor Jim O'Shea. Pay attention to Politico's sibling, a Washington, D.C. news site that's going to be launched by Jim Brady, a former WashingtonPost.com editor. Practically speaking, if these people want to do journalism going forward, they have to do it differently. They have to be liberated to do it differently. I think we see Spot Us founder David Cohn trying to liberate himself and his project from old funding models of journalism with a kind of a paper story idea. And I think universities are certainly benefiting from some of these liberated souls. Look at former Boston Globe's Walter Robinson. His students at Northeastern University have managed to get more than a dozen page one stories printed in the Boston Globe since he joined that university about 2 years ago. So I think to be a genuine media entrepreneur, you need to have a comfort level with moving out of the old lockstep ways of doing things and moving into what I call the sperm zone. You need to follow your guts, your hunches, your value systems, and let them lead you to what you think makes sense. More often than not, I think what makes sense to you will also make sense for your audiences. And that's certainly what citizen journalists are doing. No one taught them a right or a wrong way to do things. They're just trying to do what they feel is right in their community and what makes sense. They're trying to be fair and accurate. I think that this is a really hard thing for professional journalists to do. They don't quite have the creative instincts of, say, Wall Street investment houses. Journalists have grown up with rules and regulations, with templates that tell us there is a right way to do things. There's a right way to construct an inverted pyramid story. There's one way to be objective. We have codified standards and ethics. We are somewhat imperialistic in our approach and rather self-congratulating about our value to our readers. And we don't easily validate anyone who's not a member of our tribe. We embrace definitions of news that may no longer match citizen definitions. We have habits, such as our competitive streak, that are so ingrained, they may be difficult, if not totally impossible, to shed. We often think our ethics are unparalleled, even though the public keeps telling us that they don't share that view. I say we need to re-examine some of those habits and ask, are they still safeguarding journalism? Or might they actually be endangering it? In an entrepreneurial environment, I believe we can also liberate the journalism, not just the delivery platforms and the news creators. I think we can reimagine journalism in ways that will improve its usefulness to our readers. So let's look at some entrepreneurial phases. For me, I think some of the most exciting journalism ideas got off to the ground just 6 years ago with the launch of independent professional news ventures like The Voice of San Diego. And today this nonprofit site does good coverage on probably a half dozen issues with an annual operating budget of $1 million plus in grants and sponsorships and donations. I don't have a slide of that site, but around the same time, J-Lab begun funding community news startups, and we now award grants of $25,000 over 2 years. We have funded 45 of these New Voices projects that have seen through their 2-year cycle. We have a call for proposals in the field right now. In fact, the deadline is Monday. But since we've started, we have received 1,249 proposals, which I suggest to you is a really eye-popping indication of how readily people can envision meeting news and information needs in their communities by themselves. Since then, I think our news ecosystem has given rise to many different developments, including skyrocketing numbers of individual bloggers, several of whom have made themselves almost celebrities. If you look at Marcos Melitsas of the Daily Cause, Andrew Sullivan, who writes for the Daily Dish. The Daily Dish is now part of the Atlantic. We've seen eyewitness photos and videos of breaking news events, from everything from the Haiti earthquake to the Virginia Tech shootings, to the London bombings, to the tsunamis in Southeast Asia and Katrina. We've seen the blossoming of community news sites launched both by individuals, but increasingly now by companies such as AOL's Patch.com, who I understand is sniffing around here to start some new sites. And certainly we've seen traditional news outlets trying to foster citizen journalism, user-generated content, it's also called in that, when you do it for a newspaper, such as the New York Times local sections, which have been very successful. I also think we see the rise of very respected advocacy news sites, from the likes of the Sunlight Foundation, which is doing fabulous things with databases and government records, to the Council on Foreign Relations, which is doing evergreen pieces on crisis hotspots around the globe, to, very localized advocacy sites. This is a site, the Catalyst in Chicago is a very well-known site that covers public schools in Chicago. They advocate for good schools while still, from that point of view, providing very good coverage. I think we've seen the emergence of statewide news collaborations, such as the Ohio News Organization's partnership among the state's 8 newspapers. And I think we've seen the birth of several independent metro news sites. We now have at least 10 news sites around the country that have paid staffs providing professional reporting for metro and regional areas. In addition to the Voice of San Diego, they are the Texas Tribune, Lynn Post, the St. Louis Beacon, the Gotham Gazette, the Chicago News Co-op, the New Haven Independent, the Bay Area News Co-op, the Connecticut Mirror, CT Mirror, and US.net. So those of all, most of them happened, except for Voice of San Diego, in really about the last 2.5 years. As we begin a new decade, I see at least 6 or, well, maybe 4 important trends. No, 6. 6 important trends that will affect how people get news and information. Here they are. I see an increasing participation of creative technologists in building innovative news applications that very much expand this whole definition of news work. Last year, the New York Times won our Knight Batten Innovations Awards for a body of work that was built on computer programming skills. They included such things as Document Cloud to read documents online, Word Train to track keywords, and Represent to track your elected officials. A special distinction award went to applications like C-Click-Fix, which is now being used on numerous citizen journalism sites to report on potholes and other issues you want to tell your elected officials about. Another trend, I think we are going to increasingly see the rise of statewide news ventures, many of them focused on covering state capitals. And many have an investigative bent as well. These include things like the newly launched Connecticut Mirror, New Jersey Spotlight, and a site that's about to be launched in Harrisburg in the next couple of months. A third trend is I think we're going to see the growth of many more university-based news sites. Such things as Grand Avenue News at the University of Miami, your own South Los Angeles report, Mission Local at Berkeley and San Francisco. There's Fulton Hill News at Virginia Commonwealth, Madison Commons, University of Wisconsin, Grosse Pointe Today at Wayne State. We're seeing them crop up all around the country. Another trend, I think we're going to increasingly see collaborations instead of competition. not just among legacy news organizations like the Ohio News Network, but also between old media makers and new media makers. About 6 months ago, J-Lab funded a project that we call the Network Journalism Pilot Project. And in this, we paired the newspapers in Seattle, Miami, Charlotte, Asheville, and Tucson with 5 local news sites in their communities. We partially funded a coordinator to sort of be the wrangler of all the partners. And we gave each of the community news sites $5,000 in thank you money. And to be honest, I wasn't sure whether these new media makers would be insulted with a token payment of $5,000. But it turns out they felt validated by it. The collaboration seemed to be really cooking. The Seattle Times partnership in the last 6 months has grown from the original 5 to 19 partners. And they're now about to embark on a regional collaborative reporting project on graffiti throughout the Puget Sound region. Miami now has grown from 5 to 8 partners. Charlotte expects to add a whole network of university sites and the university sites around their area of North Carolina. TucsonCitizen.com was a web-only site. It partnered with sports bloggers. And again, I wasn't sure. I was a little nervous about doing just sports bloggers here. Well, these 5 partners are now not only beating the local print paper in town, but newspapers in Phoenix have now asked to begin trading content with them. And we find that the web traffic of TucsonCitizen.com is almost half of where it was from when the paper stopped publishing and it became a web-only operation 6 months ago. So stay tuned. There's very interesting things cooking in this arena. Another trend, I think, is the rise of many more metro area news initiatives. Consider that 4 of the existing 10 I mentioned to you have launched in only the last 6 months. And then lastly, there is a big and growing appetite by philanthropic foundations for starting to support community information needs. Foundations were once really worried about funding projects that might compete with very fragile legacy news organizations. That has ended. In the last 2 years, they have become so alarmed at the diminishing news coming from their downsized local newspapers, and mostly newspapers. They're seeking ways to what they call intervene. The Knight Foundation has certainly pioneered efforts to incentivize community foundations. They pledged to match the dollars that the community foundations will put up for a news and information initiative, and it's been very successful. Now, the Chicago Community Trust is issuing very innovative requests to fund ideas from small citizen journalists and local media makers throughout the Chicago area. J-Lab has now documented $142 million in grants going into news projects, large and small, around the country just since 2005. We released this report in June. At that point, it was $126 million in grants. So again, what we've been able to track in the last few months is happening fast and furiously. We're working on verifying many more, but mind you, these grants don't even include the money that goes into public broadcasters, which fund many other things other than just news, fund documentaries and entertainment and music. I think that while journalists give lip service to transparency, not all of the new media makers are so willing and so readily transparent, though, about their sources of funding. Some don't want to disclose where their grants are coming from because they don't want others to compete with them for this funding. Some funders don't want to disclose that they're given grants to news projects because they don't want to be deluged with grant proposals. And I think we're at a point in time right now where, as a profession, we need to speak out and say that people need to get over this. The public has a right to know who's funding news projects, and people need to be transparent about where their support is coming from. J-Lab recently wrapped up a project that sort of touched on 3 of these trends: the participation of a foundation, the idea of collaboration between old and new media makers, and the possibility of a new Metro News site. And I'll share our recommendations with you. I was invited by the William Penn Foundation to map media assets in the city of Philadelphia and come up with a media investment strategy for them. The foundation has a stellar track record of supporting these projects. They fund things like planphilly.com, which is an award-winning site about planning and preservation in a very historic city. They fund the Notebook, Public School Notebook, which is a 10-year-old site that reports on public schools. The foundation has also supported election and city hall reporting initiatives that involve the Philadelphia Daily News, Philly.com, and WHYY, the public television and radio network. What we uncovered in our reporting, I think, led us to recommend a blueprint for a new kind of public affairs initiative that we think has promise for more than just Philadelphia. We did content analysis of the 2 daily newspapers and 4 commercial television stations. And no one was surprised at all that coverage of public affairs issues, such topics as reform, ethics, schools, council, mayor, budget, the coverage had tanked in the last 3 years. But we were surprised to find a rather robust online community. We found 260 blogs and websites. We found about 60 of them had some journalistic DNA, and that they reported on and not just opined about the news. These included several niche sites on transportation, on politics, on technology. We also found a very entrepreneurial journalism school. Temple University was doing great things. We found a public broadcaster on the move, trying to do more local reporting. We found 2 interesting data initiatives. We also found another gem, a very robust and organized creative technology community that was centered around a place called Indie Hall, which is a collaborative workspace. So we asked, we counted actually, between the foundation's grantees, the student journalists covering Philadelphia neighborhoods and niche reporting sites, there were well over more than 100 reporters working in their own journalistic silos throughout the city. But the sites were not well known to all Philadelphians. So we asked whether there was a way to amplify their good work. More important, was there a way to aggregate not just content, but was there a way to aggregate audiences so that on different issues, city residents could collectively learn about things that were not just in their individual interest zones? So here's what we recommended. We suggested the creation of a new nonprofit public affairs website that, very much like Voice of San Diego, would not pretend to cover the waterfront, but would produce original stories very strongly focused on 6 or 8 issues, such things as politics and city hall, but also the creative economy, the art museums, the entrepreneurs, the creative technologists, the local economy, and regional narratives, things that we concluded could benefit from supplemental coverage than what they were getting in the news organizations. But unlike Voice of San Diego, we suggested that this new site collaborate or network with some of the existing individual journalism efforts in the city. That they should curate and aggregate links to their content and send additional eyeballs to the sites that were covering schools, planning and preservation, politics, technology. To cement this network and these partnerships, we suggested the creation of an enterprise reporting fund that would distribute reporting awards to the partners so that they could quickly hire a freelancer when they saw a story that needed to be turned quickly and do it. We suggested that these networks have a back-end support system offering our network of media makers help in such things as payroll processing, to ad sales, to joint libel policies. We suggested pursuing opportunities to license the network's content to a national news outlet as a way to set a very high bar for quality and also to generate revenues for the partners. We especially urged the involvement of the creative technology community. We recommended pitch-it competitions that would invite proposals for news applications, fund their development, and test them on either the core public affairs website or any of the network partner sites. So all of this happened? Well, the good news is we held a meeting last month, and a critical mass of potential partners said they want to participate. Not that all of them wouldn't say, well, why don't you just fund me so I could stay and be my own little silo? There were enough that said, you know, we think this is a good idea, and we think we would like to do this. I think the foundation expects to issue some early grants at the end of this week to begin the process of rolling this out bigger. So stay tuned. So what have I learned in my journeys through this new media world? Well, I'll close here, I think, with just a few takeaways. For those wanting to launch a community news site, frequency of fresh content is critical. It needs to be a daily exercise. Civility is valued, and it's one reason I think why so many community news sites, not newspaper sites, community news sites moderate their content. Regular Big J sites don't. You need to build a community before you can monetize it. And I believe that our network journalism pilot projects will find a way to attract revenue to their content sharing community. But you've got to get to the community first. I think you should not make the mistake of accusing citizen journalists of not being Big J professional journalists. I think their ethical codes might teach journalists a thing or two. While they aspire to be fair and accurate, they also aspire to do less harm in their communities. And as they try to seek out truth, they are less focused on gotcha quotes, what people said. They're actually much more willing to listen and entertain what people meant to say. They understand that people occasionally will misspeak. So what did you mean to say? Finally, I think, and most importantly, I think the changes facing the news industry are not just about the delivery of news. They also involve the very fundamental way people use news and perceive news. New media makers with their intimate ties to their community, I believe, are ushering in entirely new forms of journalism. From the research we released last fall, we found that this journalism is characterized by a very deliberate shift in objectivity, much more connected objectivity, that allows for reports that build on the community knowledge that many of these site founders already hold. We see journalism on these local sites increasingly becoming an active participation, not just an active observation. These sites solicit readers to participate in breaking stories as it unravels. It seeks crowdsourcing initiatives. We see very little news stories on these sites that are framed around conflict. There's virtually no scorecard journalism. There's less he said, she said reporting. We think, and what we hear, is that consumers of news on these sites are not only looking to be informed, they're looking to news to strengthen their connection and their involvement in their community. It's a very different perception of the news process. And finally, I think the lesson for us Big J journalists is this, that we really need to pay attention to these clues, because the community seems to find value here. And I believe that we can still do good journalism, but we should try to do it in ways that turn our communities on and not turn off.
Such a rich and interesting speech. We appreciate it very much. Very thoughtful, thought-provoking. Thank you, Jan. So So if you have the energy for a few
As
questions.
long as I can have my cough drop.
Yes, have your cough drop and we'll start. Felix, you might want to give us sort of a long peroration of the question before the cough drop time.
Well, I'll try not to ask a long question and say, do you agree or disagree? But I've focused on the term citizen journalist, given that we live in a community where many of the people who live here, work here, go to school here, and are around us are not citizens or eligible for citizenship in the national sense.
And the term citizen journalism totally disses them.
So I just wanted to ask you how you define citizen and whether there are implications in terms of who's included or not included in participation or the perception of participation by using a term like citizen.
I actually truly prefer the term citizen media makers. But even citizen is involved in that as well. So maybe we should just call them new media makers, because generally that's what they are. I do think that using the term citizen in any part of this does dismiss a large portion of our potential news consumers or actual news consumers. And that's not what we should be aspiring to do. We should be, aspiring to reach out. And in fact, many people in our newcomers to the United States would benefit from a sense of involvement, participation, and connection in communities.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that question? Because I was struck by the communities, and I've seen this in looking at the communities you cited in terms of active citizen journalism, like Chappaqua. These are homogenous, for the most part the ones I've seen are homogenous, highly educated, engaged citizens or residents. But in terms of communities where you do have a large foreign-born population, where you have less economic advantage, are you seeing that in communities like that as well, where you see citizen journalism happening?
We have a very interesting project at Virginia Commonwealth University called Fulton Hill News, Fulton Hill, F-U-L-T-I, and they're really involved in going into an African American community, and which didn't get any coverage really in the local newspapers, and trying to report on what's going on. And they're not doing a bad job. But I think that in a lot of these communities, and it's not just diverse communities, you find it in rural communities as well, there are limits to broadband access. They certainly have mobile phones, but mobile news apps are still developing. I think that there are efforts. We have a project at the University of Reno that has tried to, from Lake Tahoe, that tried to reach out to the Hispanic community. And there are challenges. You recruit and train 2 or 3 Hispanic reporters from the community, and 6 months later, they need to go back to Mexico to attend to a family crisis or something. And so it's very hard to sort of establish beachheads where you can get regular, ongoing coverage in the ways that you would like to do it. It's not impossible, but I think it's a slow build.
Danielle is part of the Alhambra project that you were hearing Michael Clark's talk about today with the Chinese and Latino and
Right.
And one of the other question from there is, if you do have a community which doesn't have high broadband access today, do you still, not that, as I said, Alhambra doesn't, but like a community that doesn't have high broadband access, do you invest in creating capabilities with the assumption that in the future there will be?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things Deerfield does, Deerfield is a rural community that doesn't have a lot of broadband access. And they actually put out a print newspaper 3 times a year. They put out a boatish guide, they do a fall tourism guide, and they do one other one-on-one. So, I mean, you can attend to it a little that way. You can attend to some through the public libraries. But a lot of it is by word of mouth.
Right.
yes, and the back row and then up front.
You may have touched on some in the last question, but I have noticed that Philadelphia seems to have a lot of these public affairs websites, and I'm wondering if you think there may be some difference in a culture of activism or civic engagement there versus a city like LA that makes these sites proliferate and maybe makes it easier to get them networked.
Well, to be honest, I think part of what's happening in Philadelphia is the William Penn Foundation has a very active interest in public affairs issues and news and information. They're a place-based foundation, and so they funded things like the Public School Notebook and PlanPhilly.com and City Hall, which is this kind of a see-click-fix application that the Daily News has, and they funded the Next Mayor project, and so it's a place where it has a lot of philanthropic support already. I wouldn't be surprised if you could achieve the same thing here. I mean, it sounds to me like the California Health Foundation is starting to fund more and more news issues. I think what's happening in the foundation world, I mean, in addition to being on the journalism circuit, I'm now on the foundation circuit as well, and more of these foundations are increasingly interested in how they can fund news and information projects. I think we'll see more of it.
That kind of leads into my question, which is about funding models. And what I took from your talk was that it seems like your model is that most of the time a foundation needs to usually be involved in helping to fund these things. I'm wondering if that is in fact your viewpoint, and if you see any other models of funding that are maybe a little more traditional, like the newspapers that we're seeing go away.
I think that at least to launch, I mean, some of these can launch as an individual and get momentum. And certainly, what Seattle Live did, it did a fabulous job. You guys have done it and done a good job as well. But I think what we're seeing in all the metro area news sites that are launching is that they've had the benefit of the infusion of anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million in funding just to get off the ground, to get started. Now, and for our project in Philadelphia, we've also recommended the budget comes in between $1.5 million and $1.8 million. But we also recommend declining support after 3 or 4 years, because we do think, again, once you build the community, that there are opportunities to monetize it.
So what role do you see for advertisers and community contributors and get subscribers essentially?
I think if you can get subscribers, that's great. I think there can be a high churn rate in community. I know Denver tried it and did terribly and went out of business. You've gotten a fair number, which is great. I think that you're really going to be looking at a hybrid model of support. If you can get donors or subscribers, certainly Voice of San Diego has a fairly robust community of donors and subscribers, that's great. If you can do ads and get a rate card that your small Korean nail salons can understand and afford, you can do, you can do micro ads. I think you can do sponsorships where it involves your regional hospital chain or regional libraries or things like that. I think you can do standard ads. I think, and what I've been recommending on the circuit, also growing out of our Philadelphia reporting, is that I think there's monetization in press releases. It's become very clear to me, I think when I talked to the press secretary for the mayor of Philadelphia, he was telling me his press release list has grown from 40 to 700 because people can no longer just send it to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and think that it will get any attention in the paper. There are no longer eyeballs in the newsroom to even attend to it. So you've got a vast number of city councilmen, NGOs, other business groups in the city, and I think there's no reason why you can't create your own hyper-local version of PR Newswire and charge for it. Modest amounts, but you want to run 1 or 2 press releases a quarter, $50. You want to run 6, it's 100. And put it up as press releases. You can curate them if you want to, but it becomes almost a public service. So I think there are ways that you can make money.
Do you actually, I'm sorry, does J-Lab actually support financially some of these?
Support.
Some of these sites financially, or is it just a technical support? What's your role in these?
We support startup sites, very modest funding. It's $25,000 over 2 years. You get $17,000 the first year, and you get $8,000 the second if you match it.
And that's, so you don't see yourself as 3, 4, 5, you're just startup money.
3 years.
Got it. And can it be used for anything, like for salaries, or always used for hard costs?
We don't, The only thing we don't pay is university admin fees.
And that's.
There would be nothing left of the grant.
So that is a very modest grant for 2 years, but that's never, you found that that's enough to start like these Seattle or Deerfield or?
Very often, if people just get something up and show it to people, it leverages more support in the community, and it will leverage other grants. Almost all of our sites have gotten other grants, or.
And how long have you been doing this? In other words, have you been able
Since
to?
2005.
So have you been able to detect a mortality rate at any point, at this point?
We have about 75%. After 2 years, about 75% of sites are still going on.
There was a question here, and then we'll come over here. Yes.
Do you think there are any significant benefits or drawbacks to community sites that are part of a big J site, like New York Times locals, as opposed to them being rogue and on their own? Like, what's the difference there?
I think there's more benefit if you're an individual site, only because I think there's a lot more passion about the site. It's your labor of love, and I think that while news organizations can try to get their citizen correspondent corps together, the job off rate is huge. It's a very high-touch enterprise. You have to have an editor who's just constantly recruiting and wrangling and nurturing and editing. It's very long work. When people are running sites, they care about the quality, they care about the standards, you know.
Just breathe. Yeah, people who are attempting this are all laughing and commenting with you. Yes.
Just a quick follow-up on the kind of revenue model. Is there an example of one of these online pubs that has gotten it right, where they're actually operating with positive cash flow?
Well, what Seattle blog says they're making it in the low six figures now.
It's funny though that we're talking about a husband and wife.
It's a husband and wife team.
Hours,
Those salaries.
So many of them are bootstrapped. I mean,
Right. Newcastle now is probably bringing in 70,000 without even trying. The women don't even count what they bring in. I mean, but they're more interested in doing the news and raising money. They don't have money. Their husbands are lawyers, and you know, so they don't have doing such a labor of love. But.
Well, this point you made I thought was so interesting about, you know, people volunteer to do a lot of things. They don't expect to get paid if they volunteer to do this, which obviously has a significant effect on how much people who have been expecting to get paid can then continue to expect it.
Right.
One last question or comment? Yes, Theyre?
Well, I was very intrigued with your comment about the transparency problem with funding sites, which I haven't really heard much about. And is that a kind of a growing problem?
Well, we certainly face it firsthand, and to eke out the $142 million that we eked out was a very laborious process. And interestingly enough, the big, well-established sites, Center for Public Integrity, Center for Investigative Reporting, for them, it's no problem. Here it is, you know, no questions asked. But the smaller startup sites were just like, well, you know, I don't want to give that to you. It's, you know, I want you to know where we're getting our
That's where you
money.
found it in that project.
And there's also the 990s allow for some exemptions. If it's a sole funder and you don't have to disclose it, there's a loophole where you don't have to list these in the 990s.
What's the answer? What's the answer for that?
I think the answer is to close the loophole, but
in general.
But also, I have been an advocate with funders to say, I said to the Knight Foundation, don't fund anything that won't disclose.
Can't the Knight Foundation disclose?
Hmm?
The Knight Foundation can disclose from their end, can't they?
Yes, but I'm saying to them, don't give grants to anybody who doesn't disclose. And in fact, they have since pressured one of the sites that wouldn't give us any information to disclose.
So I lied. One more.
Have you seen any kind of, legacy media responses on journalist sites in an effective way that, like either the AOLpatch.com that's really taken them on, or have they basically not been successful?
Well,
Or driven them out of businesses?
certainly the New York Times local section is right, they're going head to head with Patch right now, and we'll see how it plays out. I do think that in our 5 pilot sites on the network journalism project, where you have Seattle, Miami, and Charlotte, It's very interesting. In Seattle, I mean, we launched the project and they had their 5 wrapped up the next week, you know, and they were off cooking. In Miami, it was like, well, we only have 3 that we can partner with, and we're going to have to create 2 ourselves because, you know, the rest are just not good enough for us to partner with. So you have a little bit of that legacy kind of, and they did create 2 with 2 of their former recruits, and they chose to do it that way. Now, in truth, Miami's not as robust as Seattle in having all of this, but I would be surprised if there weren't 2 more sites that they couldn't have if they had wanted to.
That's really nice because they were aggregating all their regional blogs for a while. I mean, they had like 400 blogs they were aggregating.
Well,
that experiment.
Look at that. And in fact, 2 of their partners are community newspaper chains. So it's just a real different comfort level.
I wanted to mention one thing. I very much agree with you about collaboration being such an important part of the future for an industry, which of course has been all about competition. And as you all know, I'm sure most of you know, we administer the Selden Ring Award for Investigative Reporting, and a very nice, happy development this year is that the award will go to a story which was done primarily by a ProPublica reporter, ProPublica being a nonprofit investigative reporting outfit, but it was done in conjunction with the LA Times. All the stories were in the LA Times. A story in the Washington Post, some on ABC News, Salon. So this is a collaboration between commercial and nonprofit journalists appearing across platforms, and I think it's a great example for the future. So, you've been terrific. The audience has been great. Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you all for coming. Terrific discussion.